and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live on CGTN. We begin our program today in Bern, where Iranian President Hassan Rouhani is on his first stop in Europe. He held a bilateral meeting with his Swiss counterpart, Alain Berset, on Monday evening. Mr. Rouhani's visit to European countries is aimed at working with all possible parties to save the nuclear deal. Also on Monday, the U.S. announced sanctions on Iran will snap back in August and November to bring Tehran's oil revenue to zero, which sparked concerns and skepticism. Let's take a look at this.
New sanctions and new reactions. Iranian President Hassan Rouhani met with Swiss President Alain Berset on Monday. His visit to Switzerland is aimed at strengthening bilateral ties, among other things. Bern is Mr. Rouhani's first stop of his three-day visit to Europe. He will be in Austria on Wednesday. In his speech before Iranian expatriates in Switzerland, he warned that the regional oil supply could be jeopardized if the U.S. convinces its allies to stop buying Tehran's oil. Iran exports more than 2 million barrels of oil a day, making it OPEC's second-largest crude exporter.
It seems they do not understand what they are saying when they say Iran will not be allowed to export even a single drop of oil. All right, if you can do such a thing, do it and see the results.
Iran will allow private companies to export crude oil as part of a strategy to counter U.S. sanctions. The Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, accused Washington of forming coalitions with several Arab states to try to destabilize Iran. Also on Monday, a senior U.S. official said that U.S. sanctions on Iran will be carried out, and Washington aims to cut the export of Iran's crude oil down to zero as soon as possible.
A key part of our strategy is a campaign of maximum economic and diplomatic pressure. The first part of our sanctions will snap back on August 4th. These sanctions will include targeting Iran's automotive sector, trade in gold, and other key metals. Our remaining sanctions will snap back on November 6th. These sanctions will include targeting Iran's energy sector and petroleum-related transactions and transactions with the Central Bank of Iran.
U.S. President Donald Trump decided to drop the Iran nuclear deal in May. After that, the U.S. vowed to not only reimpose sanctions against Iran, but also impose secondary sanctions on nations that have business links with the country, including its European allies. Washington's decision was criticized across the world, and nations still party to the accord have been working to keep the deal.
For more on Iranian President Rouhani's visit to Switzerland and Austria, with us in Beijing studio, we have Zhao Tong, associate with the Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program based at Carnegie's Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Welcome back to our program, Mr. Zhao. Good to see you here. In Tehran, Iran, Professor Mohammad Marandi, he's a professor and dean of the World Faculty Studies at the University of Tehran. Professor, what a pleasure to have you. In London, we are joined by Ian Begg, a professor research fellow at the European Institute of London School of Economics and Political Science. Welcome as well, Professor. Let me begin by asking you, Professor Marandi from Iran, briefly, if you can, sir, help us to understand, is this trip to Switzerland and Austria Iran's strategy of making sure to keep the deal while isolate the United States?
Yes, I think that is a key part of the agenda. President Rouhani, I think, is going to be spending time there exploring ways to preserve the deal, but at the same time, I think that he has already made plans, and he's probably warned his European counterparts or those who he is negotiating with that Iran's patience will run out. If the Europeans don't put forward a package that preserves the nuclear deal in a way in which Iran's rights within the framework of the deal are preserved, then there's no reason for Iran to remain within the deal.
Okay.
And I think also the warning that he gave yesterday evening was also important, that he was saying if the United States and its client regimes are able to prevent Iran from exporting oil, then other countries in the Persian Gulf should expect problems as well.
I see. So a lot of different voices coming from Iran, and certainly the question is, Professor Begg, coming from Europe, do the European countries, particularly the EU countries, and of course with the United Nations organizations, do they have the guts and the capability all at the same time in order to make sure the deal will go ahead?
I think they have the political desire, but that's different from having capability, because this will depend not exclusively on governments, but on the reactions of companies. And if you're the CEO of a large exporting company which sells things to the United States, let's say a German car company, and you're faced with the possibility that you will be excluded from the US market because of the secondary sanctions imposed because of Iran, what are you going to choose? There's a moral case that says, yes, you should respect what your governments want. But if you as a CEO say, this is going to damage my company, you are going to side with the US, whether or not it's a morally correct case.
Professor Begg, if I could ask you, the 12 demands coming from the State Department by Secretary Pompeo to Iran, suggesting if Iran does all the 12 demands, as demanded by the United States, then Iran is a so-called normal country. Do you think the Europeans would agree with what the U.S. has demanded for a sovereign country?
Well, in the detail, they may want to water down some of the things that Pompeo is asking for. But let's be blunt about this. There's a nuclear element to the deal, but there's also an element of Iran's other engagement in the Middle East, which many regard as aggressive and hostile. And unless Iran is prepared to compromise on those secondary elements of the strategy, then I think it's inevitable that the US is going to prevail on this, and sanctions will be reimposed on a scale which is going to damage Iran.
May I have Professor Morandi also to comment about that? Certainly, it seems that among the 12 demands, it's not just about the nuclear issue. It's much more than the nuclear issue. It's also about where Iran's status and position will be regarding the other members of the Middle East. So do you think the Iranian regime would really think about those 12 demands? Are you going to take this seriously?
No, I don't think that the Iranians will take any demands made by the regime in Washington seriously, because all of the 12 demands are against international law and infringe upon Iran's sovereignty. And the revolution that took place almost 4 decades ago was about independence and Iran freeing itself from American subjugation. Iran's role in the region is not something that will be negotiated, because obviously Iran will not allow the extremist groups that the United States allowed to thrive in Syria and which spread to Iraq to raise the black flags in Damascus or Baghdad. The Iranians are adamant that what the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Israel, among other countries, have done is that they've destroyed so much of this region. And it's not just Syria and Iraq, it's Yemen, which the United States and its Western partners are helping to create starvation and massacre hundreds of thousands of people, if you include those who die of starvation and preventable disease. And then we have the case of Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan. So what Iran wants is stability, but Iran does not want Wahhabi extremists blowing up automobiles and buses in Tehran.
So you see very different perspectives, certainly, coming from, quote-unquote, the West and from the Iranian side. Mr. Zhao, here in Beijing, China will be, together with other countries, Russia, Germany, France, Iran, in Vienna on Friday, having this talk. This is the first talk ever after U.S. President Donald Trump announced that U.S. will withdraw from the Iranian nuclear deal. So the question is the same for China. Will China both have the guts, political desire, and the political capability of working with the other countries and keep the deal?
I think China certainly shares the basic interest with other parties in this deal, which is to preserve the JCPOA. The U.S. effort to cut Iran oil revenue is going to have important impact on Iran's economy. Iran's oil revenue comprises 50% of Iran's entire export and provides funding for more than 80% of Iran's entire government expenditure. So preventing Iran from getting that benefit will put real incentive for Iran to walk out of the deal as well. And if Iran walks out of the deal, there's a real danger that other countries in this region, especially Israel, might try to take a military option to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear bomb. And the result could be a total mess in the Middle East. And that would mess up with China's One Belt One Road initiative, in which Iran possesses a very important geographical position in that initiative. And the Middle East is a very critical region for that initiative to succeed. So China has great interest in preserving the deal, and China's own economic interests can be undermined as a result of the in-compliance of the United States. China is #1 oil importer from Iran, and Chinese economic interests, Chinese companies, state-owned companies, and also private companies, they have to reconsider their current trading relationship with Iran.
Right.
But,
so there are a lot.
But I think China is in a position to keep some of the existing business with Iran because China's, especially the small and medium-sized companies, they are not fully exposed to the American financial system.
Right. Talking about the American financial system, we see, Professor Morandi, that the U.S. sanctions, or shall I say actions toward Iran, comes in two phases, according to Ryan Hook, who is representing the State Department on July the 2nd, talking about this. The first falls on early August, which is about mainly automotive industry and also so-called special metals such as gold and others. And the second phase will be, according to the U.S. side, November, early November. That will be about oil, petroleum-related products, and also even the Central Iranian Bank. So obviously the first phase is relatively easier to handle. It is a test of Iranians' foreign business counterparts. The second phase is more of a test of the resilience of Iranians' own economy. So what do you make of Iran's strategy leading up to already early August? If you think about it, it's only a month from now.
Well, there are a number of things here that are important. One is that Iran, by abiding by the JCPOA, despite the U.S. exit of the agreement, it has been able to gather the sympathy of the global community. And that, I think, is an important asset in itself. The United States has, in certain respects, isolated itself, especially since the United States is behaving aggressively towards different countries over trade and even towards Russia as well, with the sanctions that Congress and the Senate imposed. So the United States is in a difficult position, comparatively speaking, to a few years ago. But I think also the Iranians have a new strategy, and this is something that actually people like myself have been advocating for a very long time, and that is shifting to the east. The idea of using alternative currencies, especially, for example, the yuan, and selling Iranian oil in the Chinese currency increasingly, and using, for example, Shanghai, the oil exchange there, and to allow private sector and small companies and medium-sized companies to purchase Iranian oil, I think is something that will be new to Iran, and it will be a key change in the way in which the Iranian economy functions. It will be a difficult transition, without a doubt, but I think it will be a permanent shift in Iranian economic and foreign policy, thanks to the United States. And one final point is that the rapid decline of the Iranian currency, although it has been painful, so far it's been psychological, but it's a good thing, I think, in the long term, because Iran's currency has been propped up through oil money artificially, and that has hurt the local economy for many years. And now the local economy can begin producing more easily, exporting, and also more jobs will be created. So while it has hurt the ordinary people, but the fact that the Americans through pressure have brought about this fall in the Iranian currency sort of deflects some of the blame from the administration, and it allows the small businesses and larger businesses in Iran to use this as an advantage to produce greater amounts of local goods.
So Professor Begg, it seems that Professor Morandi from Iran is suggesting there are two sides of every coin. So when you have the negative side, you do see how it could also lead to something positive about, for example, the overall Iranian economic development. Professor Begg, here is the thing. This falls on the time when U.S. tried to say we're going to withdraw from the Iranian nuclear deal. It is also the time when the Americans are saying, at least the current administration saying, oh, we're going to withdraw from the WTO to think about the so-called legislation that we have heard from the media earlier. And then it is also the United States putting itself out there saying we're not going to be in part of NAFTA, we're not going to be TPP, we're not going to be any international thing. And we are going to scrap off anything that we have earlier signed on, just like that. So, Professor Begg, many would ask, will this issue, the Iranian nuclear issue, be regarded as an overall package? Others look at the United States. And therefore, it will be, in a way, dealt with under a very different light than just an Iranian issue.
Well, let me say first that I will not for one moment try to defend the stance being adopted by the US on many of these issues. I think they're being very cavalier in their approach to international relations, damaging world stability and so on. But we cannot escape from the fundamental power of the United States in so many of these areas, in trade policy, in energy policy, in potentially nuclear policy. And I think the metaphor that comes to my mind is that with the JCPOA, what's happened is that it's a bit like a ship which has hit some rocks, and there's now a huge hole in the ship. And everybody else is working very hard to bail out the water, but the ship is still going to sink because of the size of the hole. That's the danger we face at this stage. Now, it's true. What's been said is correct, that Iran can reorientate its trade towards the east.
All right.
It can maybe benefit from the depreciation of the currency, but fundamentally the US is the powerful player in this.
All right.
And the powerful player tends to win.
All right, Mr. Zhao, I would like to use that beautiful analogy that Mr. Begg earlier suggested. So can we have enough measures to save that boat? If not, can we have at least a temporarily smaller, life-saving, smaller boat, and then build a newer boat to go against what is already existed, that is a boat with a big hole? Mr. Zhao, how long a stretch are we talking about, or is this too idealistic a suggestion that I just raised?
I think initially countries like China, Russia, India, and other European countries will try to maintain as much business with Iran as possible. They can do this through a wide range of measures, including using their local currency for transactions with Iran, to provide compensations, national compensations for companies who lose as a result of the American sanctions. They can also try to set up legislations to protect their own companies from secondary economic sanctions from the United States. In the long run, I think that depends on many new factors in the near-term future. One factor is the overall China-U.S. bilateral trade dispute. I think given that China is very annoyed by the change of attitudes of the United States on this trade dispute, China might consider using its leverage in the Iran case to make its case in U.S.-China bilateral trade dispute. So I think how this will go ahead in the future also depends on the major power competition, U.S.-China bilateral trade dispute, and many other emerging geostrategic
well, Mr. Zhao, if you suggest that, and if you look at the timetable, July the 5th, when the 5 countries, including Iran, meeting together in Geneva, that is exactly the time, July the 6th, when U.S. earlier with its rhetoric talk about heavy duties and tariffs against the Chinese imports, likely to be 34B. And that is only the first phase, and China going to react to that according to earlier Chinese words, and we're going to see what's going to happen. But there seems to be a lot going to happen on that day. Having said that, though, Professor Morandi, at this point, nobody is going to be able to understand Iran as well as Iranians do. And therefore, you probably have to figure out a solution on your own others all have their own sets of concerns and their own sets of priorities, particularly in a fast-changing world. Professor Morandi, short-term, what can Iran do?
Well, Iran has really no option but to resist, because we just saw the other day that in the gathering of the MEK terrorist organization, that Giuliani, who is very close to Trump, said that they're using these terrorist organizations, their people, to create unrest in Iran and to overthrow the government. So the United States is putting forth demands and creating conditions which basically means they are at war with Iran. What the Iranians are going to do is that they are going to look for alternatives. As I said before, it will be difficult, but I think there are a number of key issues here. One is that I think countries like China and Russia, as well as others, recognize that if the United States succeeds in weaponizing financial institutions and the dollar, then those countries can be next. The next country, if the United States is successful with Iran, then China and Russia, among others, are vulnerable. Not just as vulnerable necessarily, but they're vulnerable as well. And so the United States can take out country after country. So it's in the interest of these countries to make sure that the United States does not succeed. And on the other hand, I think that the United States is in a very difficult situation, because U.S. allies in the region, especially Saudi Arabia, it is not a very stable country. Saudi Arabia is waging a war that it's losing in Yemen. We saw in Al-Hudaydah, they were soundly defeated by the Yemenis. In Qatar, in Lebanon, in Syria, Iraq, they're failing across the board. And Mohammed bin Salman, by continuing to pursue these policies, he's leading the country towards a dead end. And by intensifying tensions with Iran, I think that creates a question mark above Saudi Arabia as well. So I think that Iran does have a lot of leverage in the international community, and the international community has an interest in preventing the United States from destroying countries.
And finally, before we go, of course, we need to have a Saudi Arabian guest to respond to what you have just said, Professor Morandi. We don't have that today, but what we are asking final words from is from Professor Begg, coming from the UK. Eventually, some of the European countries were also being labeled as so-called national threats to the United States when the tariffs on steel and aluminum products were being levied toward the European countries. So, Professor Begg, is this just a so-called storm in a teacup, or this is going to be, together with the Iranian issue and many others, for the Europeans to think twice?
The Europeans are worried, and we heard this last week from President Donald Tusk, the President of the European Council. They're worried about U.S. disengagement. They're worried about U.S. aggression on the whole range of areas that you mentioned earlier. But if I can finish maybe with a quote from the Greek philosopher Plato. He said, "Do not expect justice when might is right." And this may be a way of summing up what's going on here. The U.S. is flexing its muscles, and others, unfortunately, have to adapt to the big bully.
All right. People have been talking a lot about fairness and globalization, and this is exactly the time when those two phrases and the many meanings behind those two phrases at a time of test. For now, I want to thank the three of you for being with us. Zhao Tong, Mohammed Morandi, Ian Begg. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Really appreciate it.